It is mid-March of 2022, and the nations of the Minecraft Attack SMP are in a precarious power balance. To the west, the newly formed Irenican Empire has just finished its conquest of Kurokaigan and has reduced its king to vassalage. In the east, the ancient nation of Shanbao is prospering following an extended peace after the events of the last Great War, the Calamity. In the north, the Citroye Empire, the largest nation in the server by landmass, is consolidating and developing its natural resource-based economy, rich in mineral deposits such as gold and iron. The Empire of Citroye, also known as l'Empire de la Citroye to its francophone inhabitants, was founded following the Calamity, a catastrophic conflict which brought forth the collapse of the foremost powers of the earliest days of the SMP. Beginning as an economic and defensive pact between the numerous francophone refugees who settled in the area, being the Gouffre, Melon d'Eau, et la Citroye Souriante, these individual nations would centralize in response to the growing ascendancy of the Empire of Citroye in the north. Representatives of the superpowers of the south gathered at the renowned Shanbao Diplomatic Center to plan a war of aggression to weaken Citroye. Through plunder and siege, they sought to extract wealth from this potential rival. Furthermore, they reasoned that in such a conflict, not only would forces from the Citroyan Empire be unprepared and surprised by the attack, they would also be vastly outnumbered and outclassed. The war party was led by the Emperor of Shanbao and the newly vassalized King of Kurokaigan. The ruler of the Irenican Empire, having so recently conquered Kurokaigan, acquiesced to the wishes of his vassal for a northern conquest in order to maintain the stability of the realm. Additionally, during this meeting, the Duke of Melon d'Eau, who nominally owed allegiance to the Citroyan Empire, made a secret arrangement with the planners of the invasion for his domain to be spared from pillage in return for a pledge to not come to Citroye's defense. Following the full planning of the scheme, the Allies began preparations for the full-scale invasion of the Citroyan Empire. Irenican Kurokaigan was chosen as a forward operating base due to its proximity to Citroye. From here, the forces of the Alliance were mustered in preparation for war. But what of Citroye itself at this time? Though it controlled vast swaths of territory, little was properly defended. The largest urban center, the Gouffre, was just north of the Kurokaiganian frontier, across a jungle followed by a large and sparsely lit valley. It was from this solitary settlement that the empire was run, and where its greatest treasures were stored. By this time, whisperings were reaching the far north of a possible incoming invasion, and this news eventually made it to the Citroyan court. It is now lost to history as to how this information reached the Citroyans, but it is widely believed that the King of Irenia himself secretly warned the head of the Citroyan Empire, behind the back of his Kurokaiganian vassals. However this information was attained, the Citroyans now had a few spare precious days to prepare for the onslaught that was to come. Battlements were erected, torches were removed from all routes to the settlement, and both arrows and lava buckets were prepared atop the Gouffre high walls. Due to the advance notice that the Citroyans now had, they were able to mobilize a garrison to defend the fortress. The Empire of Citroye also called upon Melon d'Eau to prepare their soldiers for war. However, no response to this call ever came. It is on the early morning of March 8th when the invasion began in full force. Following significant preparation, the Allied forces sent a formal declaration of war to the Empire. The Allied army, composed of a multinational coalition from Shanbao, Irenica, and Kurokaigan, crossed the Citroyan border at dusk. The geography of the Gouffre did not make this an easy task. Coming from the south, they had to cross a jungle and a large unlit valley to reach the fortress. By the time the assault was ordered, it was already evening, and once they could see the fortress, night had already fallen. Consequently, before any fighting began, the attackers were already being harried by phantoms and skeletons, struggling in the dark through the Citroyan hinterlands. The primary objective of the attack was to lure the defenders out of their prepared defenses in the vicinity of the indomitable fortress, and use their numerical superiority to envelop the defenders and quickly enter the keep. However, as they were stalled by the inhospitable terrain and the lethal nighttime conditions, the Allied attackers had to reconsider their plans. The defenders knew they were coming, they held the high ground, and they knew the terrain. The attackers had to be more careful than they anticipated, and their formations began to lose cohesion. This introduced confusion into the ranks as they stopped short of the fortress, handing the strategic initiative to the defenders who were looking down upon them. It is then that the Emperor of Citroye ordered an attack. Citroyan forces then sallied forth, barreling down the valley to repulse the invaders. The attackers, spread out and disorganized from climbing the steep valley, buckled under the pressure of the counterattack. The Emperor of Shanbao himself was gravely injured, losing his prized enchanted diamond armor to the defenders, which was in turn used by the Citroyans against his own forces. It was at this decisive moment that the outcome of the war entirely turned around. The sight of the Emperor of Shanbao fleeing the field caused morale to collapse among the ranks of his soldiers, who too began to flee. The remaining forces of Arenica and Kurokaigan could not hold the line alone, and seeing their ally rout, they began to give ground to the defenders too. A large number of Kurokaigan troops were slain by their pursuers after being pushed into the western tundra and annihilated. Though the Citroyan counteroffensive eventually stalled, they had won a great victory, and the attackers were forced to withdraw and regroup at the Kurokagenian frontier. Following the catastrophic engagement at the foot of the Gouffre, the Emperor of Arenica once again made clandestine contact with his Citroyan counterpart, informing the defenders the extent of the defeat and the collapse of the alliance's morale to continue the fight. Citroyan forces returned to the safety of the fortress following their victory, reorganizing and gaining strength for the next battle. It was at this time that the attackers elected to abandon their strategy of a southward attack. Instead, they would attack from the east, using the well-developed road from Melondo as a springboard for their assault. With considerably fewer soldiers, they began the trek from their forward operating base at the Kurokagenian frontier. The second attempt to storm the Gouffre would commence once all of the Allied forces were regrouped and in position. The fortress's drawbridge was raised, so the attackers turned northwards to scale the northern portion of the wall, which was in a more suitable position to attack. Much like the first assault, by the time it was day, the defenders in the high walls of the Citroyan fortress could witness the force mustering outside of their walls, and began an active defense of the settlement. The Allied forces were offered no protection in the barren lands surrounding the fortress, and once they were in range, Citroyan archers began to rain down arrows on the ragtag formations. The few who managed to scale the wall were cast off with buckets of lava. The attackers would continue these attacks for the rest of the day, when, suddenly, the army of Melondo was sighted emerging from the eastern jungles, forcing them to contend with the potentially two hostile forces on each of their sides. Citroyan command was equally troubled seeing Melondo's standards in the distance. Having not been committed to either side of the ongoing conflict, it was decided that a decisive display of strength was needed to sway Melondo's uncommitted forces to their cause. The Allied armies also repositioned and halted their assault by the end of the day to face the potential threat, hoping that Melondo would honor its commitment to neutrality in the conflict, or even to join their side. It was at this time that the Citroyan walls suddenly opened and a large force surged forward against the withdrawing invaders. Catching them by complete surprise, the Citroyans pushed the Allied army into the eastern jungle, ever close to Melondo's host. The Allied army was rapidly routed and began to flee in every direction. Lava buckets originally prepared for the defense of the Gouffre were employed in the field to devastating effect, with many of the attackers burning alive as their surroundings set fire. The Allied army, now shattered for a second time, ceased to exist on the battlefield, with soldiers fleeing through the jungle, escaping from both armies that were surrounding them. The Citroyans did not immediately pursue for fear of provoking the fresh host to their eastern boundary. The stark victory witnessed before them convinced the army of Melondo to join Citroye. Emissaries from the duchy arrived at the war camp of the Citroyans. and they explained their absence as a great misunderstanding. They were now at the command of Citroye. In a series of 2 pitched battles, the Citroyans managed to successfully hold off against the Southern Allied coalition. The initiative was now in their hands. To the ultimate chagrin of the Iranian emperor, his vassal had led him into a disastrous war. It was not known where and with what force the Citroyans would strike in retaliation for this assault on their homeland, and the southern lords had made next to no preparations for such an eventuality. Kurikaigan was dangerously exposed, Sablater had no defenses, and the Citroyan army was in the full process of mobilization. Anything seemed possible, and the continent was on the trajectory for another calamity.